As the war between Ukraine and Russia intensifies, Russia is facing new economic sanctions. Since the start of the conflict, Russia has been subject to heavy economic sanctions by the Western Bloc led by the United States and the United Kingdom. This has crippled the Russian economy, which has also gone into a state of war economy. The drop in domestic production due to the war and the ban on imports because of sanctions, as well as the drastic restriction on the sale of oil, the main source of revenue for the Russian economy, have caused the ruble to fall to its lowest level in history and have pushed the Russian economy to the brink of collapse. The outgoing administration of U.S. President Joe Biden has imposed unprecedentedly severe sanctions on Russian oil and gas companies. At the same time, these sanctions have significantly restricted the mobility of the Russian Federation's so-called shadow fleet. But do these new sanctions deal a harsh blow to the Russian budget? We will analyze in detail the latest events and conflicts in the war in Ukraine. Before leaving office, Joe Biden's government issued a new package of sanctions against Russia. In addition to restricting the sale of Russian natural gas and oil, these sanctions also appear to prevent the Russian shadow fleet from leaving Russian ports. The sanctions imposed by the United States on Russia's oil industry on January 10th immobilized almost 1/10 of the active shadow fleet. The value of the oil exported by this shadow fleet can exceed $3.5 billion, which is a heavy blow to the Russian economy. The International Energy Agency stressed in its recently published monthly report that these new sanctions could significantly disrupt Russia's oil supply. According to experts' estimates based on ship movements, at least 65 tankers carrying Russian oil were officially blocked after the sanctions were announced by the U.S. Treasury Department. Specialists note that 5 of them, carrying around 4 million barrels of oil, stopped off the coast of China's Shandong province, where many independent refineries actively buy Far Eastern varieties such as ESPO and Sokol. 7 others dropped anchor off Singapore, and dozens more have stopped off Russia's Baltic and Far Eastern coasts. In total, about 2.5 weeks' worth of Russian oil remained blocked at sea. The United States granted 2 months to finalize deliveries that were already underway, but not all buyers are willing to accept oil in transit for fear of the repercussions of sanctions. According to international vessel tracking data, 27 tankers loaded 21.1 million barrels of crude in Russian ports during the week ending January 12th, while 28 tankers had loaded 21.2 million barrels the previous week. In December, daily exports averaged nearly 3 million barrels. Thus, 65 tankers that stopped after the imposition of sanctions could have exported approximately 53 million barrels of oil over about 2.5 weeks. According to the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air, about $6 billion worth of crude was exported in December, equivalent to 184 million euros per day. During the week ending January 12th, the value of maritime exports rose to $150 million, according to experts' calculations. Therefore, the cost of the oil blocked in these tankers could be between $3.3 and $3.6 billion. According to the latest data, the total size of the submerged fleet carrying oil around sanctions is estimated to be about 670 ships, according to Lid-List Intelligence. Thus, nearly 10% of the tankers have halted their transport. In addition to the 180 ships already under sanctions, the U.S. Treasury imposed new measures on 183 vessels. The International Energy Agency, IEA, has not yet changed its January forecast for Russia, citing uncertain expectations regarding the impact of U.S. sanctions on the market. It is too early to assess the potential impact of these new measures, but some operators are said to have started withdrawing from Iranian and Russian oil, the agency notes. Chinese companies are looking for solutions to this problem, officials say. Although there is still a period during which oil can be unloaded before the sanctions take effect, many in Shandong province are cautious about accepting oil before the Shandong Port Group, one of China's largest port operators, announces that Washington will stop accepting vessels starting in January. India, for its part, has stated that it will allow the unloading in its ports of sanctioned tankers chartered to carry oil before January 10th, up until March 12th, the end date of the liquidation period for such transactions imposed by the United States. Russia's largest shipping company admitted that the imposition of new sanctions on Sovcomflot ships had created additional operational difficulties. The company denied that its vessels are part of the Phantom Fleet. However, the U.S. Treasury has imposed restrictive measures on 69 Sovcomflow ships, including 54 tankers and 4 LNG carriers. In reality, Russia has learned to circumvent sanctions by using its shadow fleet, said political analyst Dmitry Bolkunet. Some tankers appear on the American list. In theory, Russia could find replacements for them, but this is one of the firmest measures recently taken by the Biden administration, and I believe Trump will continue this campaign. After all, it is important for the United States to promote its own companies that produce oil and deliver it to Europe and other markets, he added. This blow could harm Putin to some extent, but not enough. Experts believe that, relatively speaking, the best mechanism to force Putin to end the war in 24 hours would be to impose a temporary complete naval blockade on all vessels leaving Russian ports, as well as a land blockade for all merchant ships leaving those same ports. This measure could put an end to the war in Ukraine. There are similar examples in world practice in the 19th and 20th centuries. At that time, countries used naval blockades. The most famous was the naval blockade imposed by Napoleonic France against Great Britain, which had disastrous consequences for the latter. Not a single ship could leave the island. If the EU and the United States now decide to impose a naval blockade on all cargo leaving Russian ports, it will cause significant damage to Russia. It would not only force Putin to end the war and begin negotiations, but also to pay reparations. It would also seriously impact certain sectors of the Russian economy. This is undoubtedly the most peaceful and least confrontational measure. Experts point out that it could end the war very quickly, as it does not involve weapons but rather trade, a key element in replenishing the Kremlin's coffers. In the future, Russia could replace the sanctioned tankers and resume trade. However, it should be remembered that a naval blockade can interrupt commerce, but this issue requires extensive global debate. Only firm measures can force Putin not only to stop the war, but also to withdraw all troops from Ukraine. Unfortunately, Europeans are not discussing this. Over these 3 years of war, many European countries have changed prime ministers 2 to 4 times. Sometimes completely unexpected and uncharismatic populists come to power. Only the White House administration can take such measures if Trump is ready to make radical decisions. Europe is not prepared for this, lacking political leaders with sufficiently strong character. So, will President Trump continue the trend of excluding Russia from the oil market? And how will this benefit the United States? Experts believe that, on the one hand, Trump will continue to do so, but on the other hand, he might try to shift responsibility for security onto Europe. According to one expert, the United States has committed to arms contracts for the coming years. The Trump administration will continue this trend. It is important for the U.S. to consolidate its position in the European market for gas, oil, and other goods that the country currently produces, he added. Meanwhile, the European Union is considering restricting imports of Russian aluminum and gradually phasing out Russian liquefied natural gas, LNG, as part of a new sanctions package targeting Moscow for its large-scale invasion of Ukraine, according to people familiar with the matter. The draft measures, which would be part of the bloc's 16th sanctions package, include restrictions on dozens more ships from Moscow's shadow fleet, tankers carrying Russian oil, as well as enhanced export controls for goods used for military purposes. The measure could also mean excluding more banks from the international SWIFT payment system, said these sources, who requested anonymity. Restrictions on aluminum would be phased in over time, with the exact timetable and scope still being defined, they added. As for phasing out LNG, it could take the form of a sanction or a roadmap that the EU's executive body will present next month. Russian LNG remains one of Europe's last major energy dependencies after Moscow sharply reduced pipeline gas flows last year. The EU imported a record amount of ultra-chilled gas from Russia. So far, European officials have refrained from imposing tougher restrictions on LNG to avoid the price crises that have hit the region's industry in recent years. But new capacities from facilities under construction in PMR Pomin and Qatar between 2026 and 2027 are expected to lower prices. The draft proposals are still under discussion among member states and could change before they are presented. While many countries have called for a ban on Russian gas imports, the EU must decide whether to rely on sanctions, thus making such a ban legally binding, on regulation via the roadmap, or on a combination of both, according to officials and diplomats familiar with the talks. Sanctions could be the strongest argument to terminate contracts with Russian suppliers, but they require unanimous approval from member states and are time-limited. European governments, so far reluctant to give up Russian LNG, are watching with concern the rise in gas prices due to the cold and the new U.S. sanctions against Russian energy. An outright ban would likely only increase uncertainty in the European market, which could keep prices high. In a note, commodity strategists at ING Group, led by Warren Patterson, indicated that around 18% of the EU's LNG imports in 2024 would come from Russia. On Wednesday as well, the impact on prices of the EU's proposals remained moderate. It is also unclear how quickly a phase-out might proceed. The US and the EU have already gradually sanctioned certain Russian LNG projects to curb Moscow's export expansion plans. However, these efforts have not reduced the region's appetite for unrestricted Russian supplies. Deliveries to Europe reached a record high last year as energy companies, from France to Spain, purchased fuel through long-term contracts. Europe also became a more attractive destination than distant Asian markets. Last week, the US imposed restrictions on 2 small Russian LNG plants that exported the fuel, targeting operational export facilities for the first time. But those focusing on this latest measure by the outgoing Biden administration will soon turn to Donald Trump's policy toward Russia. Trump has pledged to end Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine while urging Europe to buy more American energy. Russia was an important supplier to Europe's aluminum market before the invasion of Ukraine, but shipments collapsed due to widespread self-sanctioning by producers and the gradual reshuffling of global supply chains. Russia accounts for about 6% of Europe's imports, and deliveries have halved from 2022 levels, explains Amy Goer, an analyst at Morgan Stanley. China has purchased larger volumes of Russian metal since the start of the war, and if an import ban is decided, its impact will depend on whether these volumes can be redirected, Goer adds. Aluminum saw virtually no change, trading at $2,563 a ton on the London Metal Exchange, while other metals were down. Some officials said that sanctions on Russian pipeline gas would not be appropriate, as a group of countries, including Hungary and Slovakia, still depend on supplies from Gazprom PJSC. According to these officials, a ban on LNG is more feasible because Spain, Belgium, and France, which handle most of this fuel, are unlikely to block punitive measures against Russia. The EU is also studying proposals to add more companies from third countries, such as China and the United Arab Emirates, that help Moscow access technologies used in weaponry, and to impose restrictions on Russia's transport sector. The EU also wants to close more loopholes, allowing Moscow to circumvent existing sanctions and to impose higher tariffs on agricultural products and fertilizers. Along with this new sanctions package, the European Union plans to adopt this set of measures next month to mark the 3rd anniversary of Russia's invasion of its neighbor. Meanwhile, Czech Prime Minister Petr Fiala said that work to increase the Czech Republic's oil supply capacity via the TAL pipeline had been completed, ending the country's need to import Russian crude. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the Czech Republic has been working to wean itself off Russian oil and gas. The country has no direct contracts left with Russian gas suppliers, and now, thanks to the TAL pipeline, it can cover its entire annual oil needs without relying on the Eastern Druzhba pipeline, which previously supplied half of its demand. This is a very important moment for the Czech Republic, as Russia can no longer blackmail us with energy supplies, Fiala said. Upgrades to the Transalpine pipeline, TAL, in Italy and Germany will double the capacity to meet the Czech Republic's annual needs to up to 8 million tons per year. Testing and certification still need to be done, but Fiala assured that the country can already rely on the TAL if there is any interruption of Russian flows through Druzhba, which has supplied the country for 6 decades. State pipeline company Mero said it expects to boost oil deliveries in the second quarter. The Czech Republic began diversifying its supply as early as 1995 with the construction of the IKL pipeline, connected to Tal in southern Germany, but one of its two refineries, both owned by Poland's Orlen Group, still processed Russian crude. Finance Minister Zbigniew Stanjura said the Czech unit of Orlen, Unipetrol, had indicated it was making no further purchases of Russian oil in the second half of the year. In a separate statement, Unipetrol said it would switch to new types of crude once the TAL upgrades are tested and fully operational, which should happen by the end of the first half of the year. The Czech Republic's dependence on Russian oil exempts it from the EU's sanctions on Russian oil delivered by pipeline. Mero's chief operating officer, Zdeněk Dunda, said in November that the Druzhba pipeline would continue to function as a backup solution even after the total end of Russian deliveries. What do you think? Let us know your opinion in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications to be informed about our new videos.